On a hot May day, the silence is shattered again. Gunfire erupts. Israeli troops stationed just beyond the parameters of an aid center have fired warning shots. Smoke bombs are being used to disperse the crowd. Panic erupts. These are no more special circumstances for Palestine. They are starving. Bombs raining down, bullets flying. Where hope ends in chaos and hunger turns deadly. Seems like the fate of this trip is written only in red. Beneath the relentless sun, the aid centers in Gaza have become a scene of desperation and destruction. The conflict between Hamas and Israel continues to intensify, plunging this enclave into unprecedented chaos. As Israeli military operations escalate and humanitarian conditions deteriorate, the region faces critical turning point. It is marked by desperate civilians storming aid centers, a renewed Israeli offensive, failed truce efforts, and internal dissent against Hamas. In recent days, thousands of Palestinians stormed a newly established aid distribution center in Rafah run by the UN-backed Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. The facility, intended to circumvent the United Nations traditional aid channels, was overwhelmed as crowds tore down fences and surged into the compound, seeking food and basic supplies after months of blockade and bombardment. In fact, the eyewitnesses described the scenes of chaos as people seized food parcels, clashed with each other, and scrambled to keep starvation at bay. In fact, the Israeli troops stationed nearby responded by firing warning shots, further escalating the panic. Videos captured the pandemonium, with gunfires echoing as people ducked for cover. Aid workers were forced to retreat, unable to manage the deluge of desperate civilians. Meanwhile, the Israel Defense Forces have launched a new phase of their military campaign, Operation Gideon's Chariot. This extensive ground operation, announced on May 17th, marked a significant escalation, with Israeli troops advancing into both northern and southern Gaza. According to the IDF, over 670 Hamas targets have been struck and dozens of Hamas operatives have been eliminated. The offensive has dismantled Hamas's infrastructure both above and below the ground, with Israeli forces now holding the key positions within Gaza. The Hamas-run Gaza Ministry of Health reports that more than 160 Palestinians were killed in a single weekend, with the death toll since the end of the last ceasefire surpassing 3,100 and thousands more being injured. The humanitarian situation is dire. Medical facilities are overwhelmed and access to emergency care is nearly impossible. In fact, the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres described the situation as beyond description, beyond atrocities and beyond humane, calling in for an immediate and permanent ceasefire. But a truce looks like a far-fetched dream. As the Gazans' nightmare continues, the United States has attempted to broker a new ceasefire deal. In fact, the latest proposal outlined by US Special Envoy Steve Witkoff would have seen the release of 10 living Israeli hostages with the return of 18 bodies in exchange for a 60-day truce, during which humanitarian aid would resume under UN supervision. In fact, the deal would have also allowed for an option to resume hostilities if negotiations for a permanent ceasefire failed. However, the proposal has faced resistance on multiple fronts. Right-wing Israeli ministers and families of some hostages argue that Hamas is now weakened and that Israel should press for unconditional surrender. On the other hand, Hamas, for its part, has rejected any deal that does not guarantee a permanent end to the war and the complete withdrawal of Israeli forces from Gaza. Confusion and conflicting reports have surrounded the negotiations. While some reports claim that Hamas has agreed to a US-mediated framework, American officials quickly dismissed these assertions as unacceptable and disappointing. In fact, Hamas insisted it is willing to release hostages only in exchange for a permanent ceasefire and has refused demanded to disarm or exile its leaders. For the first time in years, public anger against Hamas has spilled onto the streets of Gaza. In fact, in southern Gaza, protesters have been protesting for several days, with demonstrations openly calling for an end to the war and removal of Hamas from power. Footage from Khan Yunis shows young men and women chanting anti-Hamas slogans, a rare sight and a risky one also in defiance in the territory where dissent is met with harsh punishment from both parties. Protesters blame Hamas for prolonging the conflict and also accuses its leaders of sacrificing civilian lives for political gains. The protest was sparked in parts by controversial remarks made by a Hamas official who described the conflict as eternal and boasted of the group's ability to rebuild and produce more babies for each martyr. Many Gazans exhausted by war, hunger and displacement now hold Hamas responsible for their sufferings. The leadership of Hamas has been all but decimated with the confirmed death of key figures. In fact, on May 28, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu announced that Mohammed Sinwar, Hamas's Gaza chief, was killed in a precision drone strike targeting a command center beneath the European hospital in Khan Yunis. In fact, Mohammed Sinwar had risen to leadership after the death of his brother Yahya Sinwar, who was killed in a clash with Israeli forces back in October 2024. Yahya Sinwar was the mastermind behind the October 7, 2023 attack that has triggered the current war. Both Sinwar brothers now dead and their predecessor Ismaili Hania also killed in a previous Israeli strike. Hamas is facing a leadership crisis. The death of these top commanders have left a vacuum at the highest level of Hamas's military and political hierarchy. The group's ability to coordinate resistance and maintain control over its fighter and also on the civilian population is now in question, raising concerns about future fragmentation and chaos within Gaza. The current confluence of military, political and humanitarian crises has brought Hamas to a crossroads. In fact, the group is under immense pressure from multiple directions. Firstly, the military pressure. The renewed Israeli offensive has decimated Hamas's infrastructure and eliminated much of its senior leadership. The group's ability to wage organizational resistance is severely compromised. Now, talking about the humanitarian catastrophe which is unfolding. With Gaza's population on the brink of famine and aid delivery descending into chaos, Hamas faces growing resentment from the very people it claims to fight for. In fact, the political isolation is also increasing. The rejection of US broken truce proposal and insisting on maximalist demands, Hamas risks alienation potential from its allies and inviting further international ire, including from the United States, which is growing impatient with group stubbornness. In fact, internal dissent is also increasing. The eruption of anti-Hamas protests signals a loss of legitimacy and control within Gaza as civilians demand both end to war and new leadership. Of course, then comes the leadership vacuum. The deaths of Mohammed and Yahya Sinwar has left the organization without clear direction, increasing the risk of infighting and fragmentation. With its leadership disseminating, its population rebelling, and its international standing eroding, Hamas is perhaps facing the greatest existential crisis and the threat in its history. The group's refusal to compromise on key truce terms may be seen as a gamble for survival, but it is also risking the total collapse of Palestine, either at the hands of Israeli military or through internal revolt. There is also speculation that the group's continued defiance could provoke even harsher measures from Donald Trump, known for his hard-line stance on terrorism and rejection of US plan. Hamas's current trajectory may be seen as digging its own grave as it invites the wrath of both adversaries and its own people. Gaza and Hamas both stand at the edge of catastrophe. The chaos at aid centers, the devastation wrought by renewed Israeli offensive, the collapse of truce negotiation, the rise of anti-Hamas protest, and not to forget, the dissemination of its group's leadership have created a perfect storm. As Hamas faces mounting pressure from all sides, the future of the organization and faith of Gaza's 2 million residents hangs in balance. Whether Hamas can adopt, survive, or it's ultimately swept away by the forces it has unleashed remains to be seen. But for now, the people of Gaza continue to pay the highest price.